Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Welcome to Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Nick Burns. I teach international politics and diplomacy here. I want to pay a special welcome to our dean, David Elwood, who's done so much to build our school. Welcome him back from his recent trip. And also want to welcome Trey Grayson, who's the new director of the Institute of Politics. It's his 4th official day at the Kennedy School. Welcome, Trey. Tonight's discussion and debate on the dramatic events taking place in the Arab world, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, is being sponsored by the Institute of Politics, of course, because the Institute of Politics runs the forum and is such an important part of the school. Sponsored by the Kennedy School's Middle East Institute and sponsored by the Center for Middle East Studies, Harvard University. It's streaming live on www.iop.harvard.edu. Before we get to the panel, before we get to the discussion, I also wanted to bring to your attention an important forum on this coming Monday evening, February 7th. The forum is thinking about leadership with some very important guests. Nan Keohane, member of the Harvard Corporation, former president of Duke University and of Wellesley College. Dean Nitin Noria, the dean of Harvard Business School, will also be here, as will Professor Monica Higgins of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I hope if you're here at the school, or if you want to watch online, that's an important forum on Monday evening. But tonight, we're going to discuss what all of us, I think, have been consumed by over the last several weeks, and that's the extraordinary events unraveling, unfolding, I should say, in the Arab world. Starting in Tunisia, with the fall of the Ben Ali government, now focused on Cairo's Tahrir Square and the battle between reform and pro-Mubarak demonstrators we've all watched live on television over the last couple of days. Perhaps some demonstrations this weekend in places like Damascus, in Syria, or in Sana'a in Yemen. And we'll ask our panel what they think of these events, whether they'll persist, and what their meaning is for all of us outside the Arab world. We have 4 outstanding professors, all at the Kennedy School or Harvard University, starting with my good friend and colleague, Tariq Masood, Assistant Professor of Public Policy, now a media star. You've seen him all over American and international media over the last couple of days. Welcome, Tariq. Professor Malika Zegal, who is a professor in contemporary Islamic thought and life at Harvard University, who's a great expert on Tunisia, but also on Egypt. So we look forward, Professor Zegal, to your remarks. Professor Roger Owen, A.J. Meyer Professor of Middle East History at Harvard University, and a recognized expert on the history of the Arab world. And our good friend Rami Khoury, who is associated with the Kennedy School, part of our leadership team at the Belfer Center, director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. Rami's visiting us this month, so his visit's well-timed to help us think through these events. I thought what we could do, both in the discussion here on stage, but also when we get to all of you and you ask your questions and tell us what you think, is focus on 3 issues. There is a pan-Arab narrative of reform being written in these events. It's being written by young people. Some of it is leaderless, as we saw in the streets of Tunis and initially in the streets of Cairo. What caused the youth of the Arab world to take to the streets in the way they've done, largely in peaceful protests, clamoring for democracy, openness, greater human freedom? Are we going to see further ramifications in the fall of governments, as we saw in Tunisia? And is this going to last? Will it persist and turn into reform movements that can actually succeed in changing the way people live and changing the freedoms they have or don't have? That'd be my first question to focus our panel and perhaps to focus some of you. Secondly, Egypt, the keystone country of the Arab world, largest country, 85 million people, has known 3 presidents in its modern history, all generals, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. Are we witnessing in Egypt the type of profound change that could lead to a revolution, reform, freedom? Or are we also witnessing today, in President Mubarak's speech just a couple of hours ago, when he was very critical of President Obama, when he said he'd stay until September, and that they'd essentially take back the streets, are we witnessing a counteroffensive by the Egyptian government against the protesters over the last 24 hours? And finally, how should the rest of us, who are not the actors in this drama, watching from Harvard, watching from all the countries represented here, how should we react What's the role of the international community, of the UN, of the Arab world? What's the role of President Obama and the United States? And what's the proper balance here between public statements calling for reform, perhaps, and quiet diplomacy behind the scenes trying to influence the Egyptian government and some of the other regional governments to move forward on the agenda that the people in the streets believe is a very important one. So there's a lot to talk about. This is a wonderful panel. And I'm going to ask Professor Tariq Masoud to start us off. Tariq, what is your perspective on the meaning of the events that we're seeing?
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for coming and being interested in this topic. I did not know that people were interested in the Middle East. So I think that the meaning of this event, I think in part you're right. This is a kind of a pan-Arab story. This begins in Tunisia with a fruit seller who'd been wronged, burning himself. And now we see that the people of Egypt were inspired by what happened and are now demanding their own rights. As I've said before, there's a kind of cultural change that you observe in Egypt. Now, I have the worst timing of anybody in the world, right? So I left Egypt on the Friday before these protests started. And I had to tell my chairman, that I wanted the fall semester off because there were elections happening in Egypt. And I needed to be there as this momentous event of elections occurred. And of course, nothing happened during the elections except for fraud. And I was very depressed. And it's only when I leave that you say, okay, now we're going to do this. But I think in part they were inspired by the Tunisian example. Before Tunisia, Egyptians would see protests. There were protests by these young people who were trying desperately to get something started. And I think folks would walk by them and say, God bless them, they're really doing God's work. But how are you going to unseat this regime? This regime has full command of this society. How are they going to get rid of it? After Tunisia, when Ben Ali left, I think it created a real change and a sense of the Egyptians' collective advocacy. So now, after Tunisia, they'd walk by a protest and think, well, they did it in Tunisia, we can do it here. So I think that's one of the most significant things about this, is not just the kind of pan-Arab nature, but the deep cultural change that isn't going away. And then the regime, of course, with its response. Who would have thought that Hosni Mubarak, this very boring gentleman who seemed to be, over the last 30 years, committed not simply just to keeping himself in power, but also to slowly reforming the society, getting rid of the command state, etc. I mean, this is a country where they had spent a lot of time trying to convince investors that they were not a banana republic, that you could invest there, that it was a country of laws. And they hadn't been completely successful in that effort, but they'd been somewhat successful. Who would have thought that in order for him to stay in power, he would have shut off the internet and taken all of these very dramatic steps to foment disorder, which will, of course, even if these moves are successful and let him keep his seat, they will have completely obliterated whatever legacy of reform he could have laid claim to beforehand. So these are things that we could not have seen. And again, even this provoked a cultural change, because how did the Egyptian people respond at this complete failure of their state, of the exposure of their state as really not interested at all in protecting them? They responded by protecting themselves. And so, whatever happens, whatever the end game is in this particular scenario, I think that the Egyptian people are going to be much more formidable than they were previously. The question that you had asked about whether this will result in a kind of democracy, how will this resolve itself? This is where we move from the inspiring to the very boring and mundane and technical, because how do you transform this, as you say, youthful, semi-leaderless movement, this expression of popular anger and desire for freedom and for reform, into an actually concrete group of individuals who can negotiate with whoever they need to negotiate with in order to actually affect concrete transition to democracy. And that is going to be much harder. So do you want me to keep going? I don't know what the rules are. I mean, I have 5 minutes to continue.
The rules are that you have about a minute left.
Okay, fantastic. Good. So the main issue as I see it is this, that basically you have two paths right now before you in Egypt. The first path is that the opposition, the people in the street, somehow, by some process, figure out who will represent them. And those people who represent them will negotiate with the regime on a new constitution and an entirely new set of institutions to govern Egyptian society. That's one way, and that's what many of the protesters are asking for. They want Mubarak to leave, they want to put this constitution aside, and then they want concrete negotiations about a new way forward. Another path that you might take would be to actually use the existing constitution to effect democratic reform. And this is the gambit that Mr. Mubarak is trying to play. He's saying, let me stay in power, and I will actually lead this process of constitutional reform. The parliament, of course, has to discuss any bills, any amendments to the constitution. Allow me to stay in power and do this. And of course, the Egyptian people are not buying it. They do not at all have any faith in Mr. Mubarak's ability or desire to actually lead a genuine reform process. But there could be a kind of middle path between Mubarak staying until the end of his term and getting rid of existing institutions. Because the thing I worry about, if Mubarak left and they said we're going to suspend the constitution and negotiate a new one, what I worry about is Mohammed al-Baradei and the representatives of the opposition now sitting down with Omar Suleiman or whoever it is they need to sit down with, and Mubarak is left. And the crowds have dissipated because they have achieved their victory. And Omar Suleiman will look at these people, these opposition leaders, who have no formal mandate and who now no longer have the force of the crowds behind them. They may have the threat of the force of the crowds behind them, but the crowds aren't there anymore. And one worries that he could take them for a very long ride and that we would not see reform in the near term. Now, I'll tell you another thing. In the past, I didn't see this coming, right? I didn't see this. So now my prognostication of what would happen if Mubarak left, take it with not a grain of salt, take it with a big bucket of salt. But this is the worry, and so how to get to the next stage is a question.
And Tarek, a very quick question. I'd like the others to consider this as well. If we look back at other reform revolutions in recent history, Russia had Yeltsin, and Poland had Wałęsa, and the Czechoslovak state had Václav Havel. Is that who el-Baradei is, or Amr Musa, or is there a nucleus of people who represent a group that can contest for power with the state, an authoritarian state?
I think that this is the question. El-Baradei certainly has the potential to be that. Whether he actually is that, I don't know. I hear conflicting reports. I see conflicting images. El-Baradei greeted by protesters as a kind of, embodiment of their hopes. Others, images are of El-Baradei ignored by many protesters and people thinking, who is this gentleman who's coming, parachuting in? He's not been with us through our struggle through the years. I think that is a question. But I also think it's not the main question. I feel as if the opposition could get their act together enough to have him at least be, if not their Wałęsa, at least the kind of dutiful clerk who will sit and transmit their demands to the regime. The question is, will the regime actually negotiate in good faith?
Thank you. Professor Segal, you are unique in the respect that you are an expert on Tunisia and you're an expert on Egypt. And I think we also want to hear about your reflections on what just happened in Tunisia with the fall of the Ben Ali government and whether or not you see links between the protest movements or at least inspiration there.
Of course. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that this is quite an extraordinary moment for the history of the modern Middle East. The Tunisians started by ousting their dictator on January the 14th of 2011. So this is the first time it happens in the history of the modern Arab Middle East. And it has shown to others in the region that it can be done. So it has really opened up the domain of possibilities, the domain of political imagination. It's really the wall of fear that has fallen with this event, I think, and that has changed the psychology, the culture of the region. And I'm not sure if other countries of the Middle East will necessarily follow in the footsteps of Tunisia and maybe Egypt. But the pressure is now on all the authoritarian regimes of the Middle East. And I think that's an important moment. What has happened in Tunisia and what may happen in Egypt and what has already happened in Egypt, in fact, is probably the sign of future deep changes in the region of the Middle East. And all these countries you have spoken of in pan-Arab movement, all these countries have similar economic and political problems. Let me go back to the Tunisian revolution and the current events in Egypt too, because I think there are real similarities there. They are caused by a lack of economic and political opportunities in the context of dictatorial regimes. And the catalyst of the revolution in Tunisia was really the suffering caused by unemployment, especially the unemployment of the educated youth, as exemplified by Mohamed Bouaziz's immolation in Sidi Bouzid on December 17. But I think these movements in Tunisia and Egypt have to be analyzed beyond the usual cyclical bread riots that we have seen going on since the 70s in the Arab Middle East. The movement became very quickly a political movement. And I spent a long time looking at all the economic demographic indicators. And frankly, the idea of a specificity of Tunisia that was developed before Egypt started does not convince me anymore. I think there is a deep political change, a deep cultural change that has started to really take place with those protests and this revolution in Tunisia. The demonstrations in Tunisia in particular, but I think it's the same in Egypt too, they really cut across all sectors of society. There was no Islamist slogans during the demonstrations in Tunisia, no leftist slogans, no ideological demand. The demand is a demand for radical political regime change, for freedom, hurriya, karama, dignity. The notion of dignity comes back all the time. I heard it in Egypt too. Representation and government accountability. These are very, very deep demands coming from those demonstrators. Now, does the revolution in Tunisia mean real regime change? I think it's too early to tell. In Tunisia, the head of the regime is gone, but what about the pillars of the regime? And I'm thinking more particularly about the police on the one hand, and the party in power on the other hand. These are still there, and we have a real institutional problem there. You're asking, what do we need? We need expertise on how to operate with the transition, how to institutionalize democracy. We have the same discussion as in Egypt. Do we need a drafting constitutional assembly or not? Or do we only need to reform our constitution? Should we start with elections or not? And frankly, do we need a presidential regime? You asked, do we have men or women at the head of these movements? This is a people's movement without heads. And so do we really need another charismatic leader who will confiscate the political resources and the economic resources? That's my question. So that's a question that's very much on the table currently in Tunisia. Now, another question that I would like to ask, it's the question of Islam and the Islamists. If you look at the media in Europe, but also in this country, in the United States, the current events are often read through the lens of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So is the alternative between a pro-Western dictatorship on the one hand or an Islamic state on the other hand? I think we should not read the situation in these terms. I think we're beyond that type of alternative. And this is something I'd like to discuss maybe a little bit later. I think these are national liberation movements. They are liberations that are Tunisian, Egyptian, maybe Syrian, etc., etc. I think what we see are not jasmine revolutions. I don't like the term jasmine revolution. I think it markets Tunisia as this miracle of, economic growth, which in fact it was not. I think it's a Tunisian revolution, and it's not going to be easy. So I think jasmine is not the right term, and it's not the season for jasmine in Tunisia yet. So I'll be very cautious about this. If the Islamists come back, and they have come back already in Tunisia, Rashid al-Ghannouchi has come back, they will have to participate in a democratic transition as any other movement. There are other movements in Tunisia. All the political opposition movements are extremely weak because they have been, in fact, weakened by this regime that we had, in fact, not just under Ben Ali, but also under Bourguiba. So the opposition is extremely weak. But if we have a transition towards democracy, a real one, they will participate as any other, and we'll have our debates, we'll have our cultural wars. But I think it's time for us to be able to have those debates and to think freely about the relationship between state, Islam, and politics. I think truly the Tunisian and Egyptian experiences can inspire other populations in the region. I think the army has played a pivotal role in Tunisia and is playing, of course, a pivotal role in Egypt. The army, for the moment, has not repressed the demonstrations, contrary to China in 1989 and contrary to Iran in 2010. So I think it has hinged really, for the moment, on the behavior and the state of mind of the army. And today it seems to me that the decision to lead or not to lead towards a transition in Egypt is really in the hands of the army. So we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. And very quickly, Professor, I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question, if I could.
Sure.
There's been a revolution in Tunisia. The authoritarian leader fell. But has there been reform? Will there be a true revolution to change the way that government serves the people, or are we likely to see just new faces, new names, but the same authoritarianism?
It's a very good question. We don't know yet. The people in the street, the pressure of the street has forced the first interim government to dismiss the old faces and to bring in new faces, so that's a very good sign. There is today a commission for political reforms that is headed by Ayad Ben Ashur, who is one of the top lawyers in the country, and he's working with constitutional lawyers in Tunisia. So there are signs of hope, but I think everybody has to remain very vigilant. We'll see how the youth in particular and the new media can play a role in this popular vigilance. Yes.
Thank you very much. Professor Owen, you've observed the Middle East for a long time. Are we witnessing epochal change, or perhaps change that might not bear fruit?
Well, I'll say a few words about the Pan-Arab background, if I may,
Thank you.
and then come to that.
Thank you.
I had the good fortune or the misfortune to complete a manuscript about which I called Presidents for Life and the Politics of Succession, which has been rapidly overtaken by events. And I shall have to have a very large epilogue. But I will say a few words about Presidents for Life anyway, because this is the phenomenon, this is the background to what we're talking about, and then say something about the turmoil in terms of the basic weaknesses of the regimes concerned. So why so many Presidents for Life? And what are we talking about, or what were we talking about at the end of last year? There are 9 Arab republics, 7 of which are ruled by seven of which were ruled by Presidents for Life, 5 in North Africa and 2 in the Arab East. So basically we're talking much more about a North African phenomenon than we are about the eastern part of the Arab world at this particular moment. Of these republics, 6 were ruled by someone over 60. Syria being the only exception. And of these, 1 was in power since 1969, that is Gaddafi, once since the 70s, 3 since the 80s, and 1 since the 90s. So one is dealing with what I call a club of increasingly old men who not only showed no intention of leaving until they were carried out, but in many cases had every intention of allowing a relative of some kind, a son if they had one, to succeed them. So that is the old world, which is still there up to a point and which is under attack. There were 2 main reasons for this. One was the ability of regimes to coup-proof themselves after the many military coups of the 60s. So basically, if you were in power in 1969 and you coup-proofed yourself, by Colonel Gaddafi, who happened to be the military leader of the revolution, you remained in power. And you are still in power. And this was also helped by the fact that the Arab world had a greater centralized administrative and bureaucratic system coming out of the colonial period. And there's also a possible demonstration effect here. I think when Abdelaziz Bouteflika of Algeria decided to abolish the two-term limits for a president by changing the constitution, he was surrounded by cronies who said to him, Abdelaziz, do what everybody else is doing. This is what seemed to be the way in which, a kind of Arab demonstration effect, this seemed to be the way in which these regimes were run. And they had many similarities. They were strongly centralized security states, run by, in a very personalized way, by a president and a crony elite involving the top echelons of business, the army, and so on. But in my last chapter, I was going to point to the many weaknesses, and I think this has something to do with our discussion. They were extremely inefficient regimes, however centralized. They could not manage prices. They could not manage anything except in security terms. And there was a link, I think, between the cronies and the inefficiency in that this long string of accidents that has beset Egypt, ferry disasters and so on, was clearly something to do with cronyism and inefficiency, which became more and more as time went on. Then these regimes found themselves with the need to legitimate themselves by elections and the manipulation of constitutions. And this proved an extremely difficult role, because elections could be overmanaged, and I think Egypt is a perfect example of that, of a complete misunderstanding by Gamal Mubarak and his friends in the National Democratic Party, so overmanaging the election, not allowing any opposition, and really calling attention to, instead of legitimizing, delegitimizing the regime by their activities. Then there was the question of succession, and the fact that after there was a great deal of uncertainty and so on about who was going to succeed these old men, and a legitimate concern about what was going to happen. And finally, everything appeared to be getting worse in the last years as the presidents got older, and I could feel this palpably when I was in Tunisia a year or so ago, when the young men of Tunisia were in despair. This hideous family that is ruling us. They didn't say that because they didn't dare, but I could feel them thinking. This hideous family will just go on and on and on. Even after Ben Ali dies, his wife will be there and his son-in-law will be there. So there was absolutely no hope. So I think they were unstable, not stable, and they were ripe for the nationwide demonstrations, but no one could actually have seen the spark that ignited them. And now I think we're having a counter-demonstration effect, spreading from one Arab country to another. As for the lessons, I think we have to look. This is not happening everywhere. There are some places where things are better than others. Kings seem to be doing better than presidents at the moment, and Rami, I know, has some ideas about this. You are also protected by sectarianism. In Lebanon, you can't have a strong president. All Lebanese presidents last for 6 years, unless the Syrians say that they should last for 9 years. But still, they leave. And in Iraq, you have a weak presidential system because it's also sectarian, and there's a kind of balance. So, in fact, you are lucky to live in Lebanon and Iraq, and have been much less lucky to live in one of the North African states. And then I think, as we've mentioned, there is the question of the army. And just ending on a note about where we are with Egypt. I think it's generally understood among the American officers that I deal with that the Egyptian army is extremely weak, actually, in terms of its fighting capacity, its ability to do anything very much, wholly dependent on American aid and American support. And therefore, I would think the weak spot of the Mubarak regime that Field Marshal Tantawi, the head of the army, is aware that if Barack Obama really got tough with him, they would be in difficulty. But certainly the study of armies and the relationship of armies and what is the military interest is back with a vengeance. And I'll stop there.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up
Yeah.
question? When I lived in Egypt many years ago, the army may have been weak relative to other militaries in fighting capacity, but it was seen to be kind of the backbone of the country, an honored institution, trusted by a lot of people. And I was struck by the statement that the military made 3 or 4 nights ago: we will safeguard the people of Egypt. And in fact, today they went into Tahrir Square and it literally separated these two warring groups. So is it a question of external weakness, but perhaps being the institution that might be the safeguard, the pillar of a transition? Do you see that potential in the Egyptian military?
Well, I think institutionally, yes, it has a reputation. Whether it has the capacity to do things, to clear the streets without enormous amount of bloodshed, whether it can even act efficiently as an internal security force, seems to me to be tested. And then we talk about the army. And I think we're back to the question of there are generals who have one set of interests. There are colonels and people with troop command who led the original military coups in the 50s and 60s, who may have quite a different idea and who are much more likely to be politicized and concerned with what they're doing. I think that's how I would answer that.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Professor Rahmi Houri, who is a big part of our Middle East program here at the Kennedy School. We're really happy he's here. Rahmi, you live in Beirut. We've now just traveled in this one discussion from Tunisia to Egypt. We've talked about some other states, and now Beirut, also turbulent. One question, if you would just touch on in addition to your remarks, is how does Hezbollah view these events? How does Hamas view them? How does Iran view them? I think you have a unique perspective based on where you live.
Thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure to be back at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I'm actually spending this month at the Farah Center at Tufts University, and I thought if I came in February I could watch a lot of good college basketball games and stay in for the snow.
Stay for March Madness.
Get some work done, but now we're busy with all this stuff going on in the Arab world. But I think it's a really extraordinary moment. And let me make a couple of quick comments about the general themes, and then I'll answer your questions, particularly about Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Iran. I think it's really important to understand a few things, and I say this based on the last 40 years living in the Arab world and traveling around constantly. What's going on now is absolutely no surprise. Anybody who studies the Arab world and looked beyond the surface manifestations of the exercise of power would have understood that there was massive discontent below the surface. And if you take just Egypt, for example, they've been trying for years, the judges, the Kifaya movement, the Muslim Brothers, the trade unions, the student groups, the human rights activists. They've been doing this year after year after year for the last 20, 30 years, and they've been hit over the head by the state with the direct, consistent, and unrelenting support of foreign governments, especially the United States and France and Britain and the European Union. There is no surprise about what's going on now. Why did it happen now? It happened now because a combination of degrading experiences has afflicted hundreds of thousands of young people across the region who can't get sufficient jobs. If they get a job, they don't get enough money to get married. If they get to college, they may or may not have the opportunity to compete equally in life. A combination of social and economic pressures, political degradation, corruption, abuse of power, watching the continued Israeli colonization of Palestinian and Arab lands and attacks against Arab countries, watching foreign armies coming in year after year and attacking different countries and threatening them and making regime change, watching the massive hypocrisy of Western governments to bend the rules about who can have peaceful nuclear power and who cannot. A cumulative number of degrading treatments that the average citizen has felt that have culminated in not just a process of degradation, but dehumanization. People felt that they had not just lost their rights as citizens, but they had lost many of their attributes of humanity, of human beings. They weren't allowed to listen to what they wanted to on the radio. They weren't allowed to read what they wanted to. They weren't allowed to have a public debate. They couldn't talk openly in some of the severe security police states in the Arab world. They couldn't even talk with their neighbors. They were afraid of who was listening and what would happen to them. This went on for decade after decade after decade, and finally it snapped. And one guy burned himself in Tunisia, and then the wave spread. You mentioned Poland, Lech Walesa. The Tunis situation I wrote when it happened is a solidarity situation, that it starts in one place in the Arab world and it will spread, like Solidarity brought about the fall of the Soviet Union 10 years later and the whole Soviet empire. So I think the reason for this is that the nature of the grievances and the complaints that ordinary people have are very common throughout the region, except for the rich oil-producing states. You don't have these situations in Qatar or Kuwait, much of Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. But you have it in the 85% of the rest of the Arab population. The nature of the degradation is the same. The nature of the political rule, the control of power, the exercise of power, the abuse of power is very similar throughout most of these countries. The monarchies have a little bit of a different situation. They have a little bit more legitimacy for various reasons, and paradoxically the monarchies tend to be a little bit more account susceptible, listening to their people. They feel more vulnerable, therefore they act with more accountability, and they're a bit more sensitive to what their people feel. There's some fantastic information that has just been made available recently by the Gallup organization, which has done some amazing polling among young people in the Arab world in every single Arab country. 3 polls in the last year and a half for this group in Qatar called Silatec, which does studies about the transition from education to work. And polling among something like 50 or 60,000 Arab young people between the ages of 15 and 29 revealed some amazing data that we knew instinctively but is now verified. For instance, the number of young Arabs in this age group who are mostly well-educated that want to immigrate and leave permanently averages around 30% for the whole region. But a third of the best educated, most productive young people want to leave their countries. They just want to get out of there. And in Tunis, and particularly in Tunis, they say, unlike most of the rest of the Arab countries where they say they want to leave mainly because of economic opportunities or the jobs, prices, cost of living, in Tunis they say because of the nature of the governance system. They're fed up with being degraded and treated without their basic rights. And the number of young people who want to immigrate in places like Morocco reaches 43%. In Tunis it was 46%. And then you have data, for instance, confidence in the judicial system. The number of people who have confidence in the judicial system and the young people is around 50%. Half of them just have no confidence in it. Confidence in the government roughly is the same, around 50, 55%. About 30 to 38% in most of the poor and middle-income Arab countries. Only about 30, 38% feel that the elections are credible. 2/3 of the people don't feel the elections make any sense whatsoever. So there's lots of data like this. Only 1/3 of young people, and this is the age 15 to 29 when they're getting married, setting up houses, only 1/3 say they can have any chance of finding affordable housing. 2/3 have no chance. This is the young people of the Arab world speaking. The more important than all, and there's lots and lots of this data. Go to silatec.com and you can find it, or the Gallup site. And this has been known for years, but nobody's done anything about it. Neither the Arab power structure nor the foreign governments who support them. The other important thing is that all of this sentiment among young people is almost identical with the adults. There's virtually no difference among young people and adults in the Arab world in this data, except for one statistic, which is young people are more likely to want to immigrate because of the nature of their lives. Yet older people are not susceptible to wanting to immigrate. So we have a really serious problem that's been building up for years and years and has now exploded. I think what we are seeing is not just discontent that explodes and wants to change leadership. What we're seeing, I believe, is the most historic moment in the modern Arab world. In the last century, in the last 110 years since, or last 100 years since the birth of the modern Arab world around 1920, we have, I think, for the first time, the beginnings of a process of popular self-determination in the Arab countries. The first time ever, we will start seeing Arab citizenries defining their countries, defining their power structure, their policies, their national values, their sectarian religious balance, the role of the army, the control of the military, accountability of finances. We're seeing, for the first time, the possibility of self-determinant Arab citizens, not just saying they want to be free, but saying they want to organize their countries. What we may be seeing is the re-legitimization, or I would say the first ever legitimization of governance and power structures in the Arab world. If things move smoothly, this is the most important moment since the birth of these countries. 90 years ago. And we've had another moment in the 70s and 80s when most of these countries were taken over by the security services and the military, and have kept this region locked in this condition for so long. It's interesting to note that the slogans that we're hearing that people are calling for, dignity, freedom, equality, are exactly the same thing that the Islamist movement started talking about in the 70s and 80s. Al-karama wal-adala, dignity and equality, exactly the same things. Once the population with a sectarian trend brings this out into the open, the Islamists will mostly melt away and go back to getting their 15-20%. The Islamists will be like George Wallace in the South. They'll always get 15-20%. They won't get more than that. Once the other people step up, there was nobody else who could challenge the governments when the Islamists were there. Therefore, they became the big boogeyman. Last point, I think I've run out of time. Last point. These transitions take a lot of time. It took the Western world 500 years to go from the Magna Carta to the French Revolution. It took the United States 300 years to go from slavery to giving women the vote and giving blacks equal rights. These things take time. It's unrealistic for simpletons on American television or other people to start looking at us. Simpletons who work for the networks. The guests are always really great. Simpletons who work for the networks. And there's some simpleton politicians, but we won't name them. But you're not a politician.
We're not going to name any names tonight.
No. But for people to expect this to happen quickly and say what's going to happen next week and what's going to happen next month is unrealistic, unfair, and will be seen by the majority of people in the Middle East as a continuation of the kind of Western racist colonialism double standard that they're fed up with. And I think a subscript to this issue going on now is that people who are criticizing their governments will also start criticizing those foreign powers who supported them for many years. So I think what the U.S. should do, you asked what the U.S. should do, should just leave this. The U.S. should come out for the first time ever and put its policy where its mouth is and say, we support freedom, we support equality, we support self-determination. We will deal with any elected government that accepts majority rule and protects minority rights. They should apply the same standards in the Arab world that it does everywhere else, and people will rush to embrace the United States. Hezbollah, Iran, you mentioned Hezbollah and Iran and these groups. These are a manifestation of a response from populations to conditions of degradation, of double standard, of predatory foreign attacks, and many other things that they complain about. In Lebanon, the absence of a strong central state meant that somebody had to emerge and address issues of ending the Israeli occupation or helping the Shiites stop being third-class citizens. The rise of Iran is well known, the Islamist revolution, which has now, I think, become largely delegitimized. There's many different specific reasons for what's going on in Iran and Lebanon, which are specific, I believe, to those countries and should not be generalized. The point is the United States and the West and the Europeans and others missed the boat when they refused to deal with Hamas when it won a democratic election. They should not miss the boat again this time. The United States should stand with democratically elected people, the consent of the governed. That's what this country stands for. That's what it should define its foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all four of you for your insights and your willingness to share your views. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but very quickly, Rahmi has now put on the table the third question. What should the United States do? I wonder if, in a very brief 30 to 60 seconds, what should President Obama do? We talked in my class today about President Obama perched on a high wire, no safety net, juggling competing priorities. He has done what Rahmi said. He's thrown his rhetorical support to the people of Egypt. He has had an open disagreement today on television with President Mubarak. And yet, that's one part of the juggling act. The other part is the real, concrete national interests. The fact that Egypt has a peace with Israel for the last 3 decades. If that were to be abrogated, all bets are off in the Middle East. The fact that Egypt has been standing with the U.S. and Europe on counterterrorism, the Suez Canal lifeline open to Europe, energy flows, the fact that Egypt's been containing Iran with the rest of the Arab world and the U.S. There's a lot at stake for the U.S. Does the president have the balance right in this very difficult, complex environment, Tariq?
He's certainly got a very tough task ahead of him. Look, I mean, I think he's trying to do the right thing. You can't, on the one hand, have this policy that Rami described. I wouldn't describe it in quite such, eloquent or forceful terms. But, you have had this policy where we've got long-standing alliances with these governments. And, so I can understand why you would be reluctant or why he would be trying to thread this needle, a little bit delicately. But I think, look, the end of the day is this. You can't bet against the people. You can never bet against the people. So eventually they are going to achieve their freedom. And then they're going to ask, where was the United States when I was engaged in this process? Was the United States with me or was it against me? And I think if the conclusion is that the United States was against them, that's a much greater risk to our foreign policy long-term in that region than any of these other short-term issues.
Thank you. And Professor Gazegal, has the President said enough, done enough to indicate to the Arab people the test that Tariq just posed for him?
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure he said enough. We'll see how he's perceived in a few weeks or months. What I see is that Obama is probably a little bit at a loss. It's hard to walk this fine line, and it's hard to know what to do. Yeah. And so it tells me that the Obama administration is not leading things here. They're not leading the whole situation. They're waiting. They're very reactive, but not necessarily leading the whole thing. So there is an element of weakness, in a way, in this new position that the U.S. has in the region. Just a note about Tunisia. I think Tunisians were very lucky that nobody paid attention. Tunisia was very lucky not to be part of the big geopolitical game in the region, because Tunisia is not important in terms of the alliances that are taking place in the Middle East. So, of course, Tunisia is an ally of France and the United States, but it doesn't play an important role in diplomacy. And therefore, they were left alone to do their revolution. And I think they were lucky to be left alone for some time.
Thank you. And Professor Owen, you get the last word in this round. President Obama said the other night, he said, this is my words, I can't remember exactly, this is not about us. The Egyptian people will decide this. Foreign governments should not be dictating, directing, deciding. Is that weakness, as Professor Zagal is, or is it a strength? And is it an insight into how distant, perhaps, we should be as in intervening in these affairs?
I don't think you can be purist about it. I think that he's in, and his words will be carefully weighted. And it was my impression that he'd worked out some kind of end game with Mubarak in their long conversation on Saturday night about going gracefully and doing various kinds of things. And whoever is calling the shots in Egypt has defied him and humiliated him, as far as I'm concerned. And so I don't think he has to recover from that with some pretty forceful language, it would seem to me. Otherwise, he will be accused in the Middle East of being just another hypocritical American president, and that he's being told by the Zionists to keep Mubarak in power and keep the peace treaty in place. That's my own feeling about that.
Thank you. We'll go to questions. To give President Obama his due, President Mubarak just hit back at him rhetorically a couple of hours ago. Yeah. So we'll see what happens tomorrow in this fast-paced crisis. We're going to go to the audience for questions. A couple of ground rules. There are 4 microphones. You see one here on the floor, one there, one in this balcony where the gentleman is already standing, and one here. And I'll just start over here. A couple of ground rules for you. Please identify yourself just by name. Second, brevity is always appreciated at the Kennedy School. Third, statements and questions always end in a question mark. Jad, from Lebanon, one of our great students here, you've got the floor first.
Thank you. My question touches on what you've been talking about, specifically the American position, the American administration. Unlike Lebanon, Egypt is not used to the lack of order It is used to an order of things, stability for the past 30 years, just like many regimes, whereas the Lebanese are used to chaos and they used to have their lives continue without government, let's say. My fear is that is it possible that the need of order of the Egyptian society in the actual situation of chaos, if it is extended for a while, is there a tendency or a possibility that the need for order creates calls for the army to re-establish that order? That would also coincide for maybe the same level of fear on the international level of the Americans and Israel, that are also afraid of this extended situation of chaos because of the obvious interests of Israel. And could those low level of tolerances in the Egyptian society and on the international community, particularly America, coincide in wanting the military to fast come in and to kind of re-put some order in that chaos, with the risk being that there's a perpetuated Suleiman scenario, negotiating with no one, and it's a kind of pushing down then the positive effects of the latest revolution.
Thank you, Jad. Tarek.
That's a great question. I think certainly that we've seen that the regime strategy, part of the regime strategy to deal with this, was to allow or foment the kind of chaos that you're talking about, and gamble that it would create a yearning for order or return to normalcy. And I think what we're seeing is that hasn't quite worked. That on the contrary, what it generated was more anger at this regime, more of a feeling that the fundamental change needed to occur. The real test is going to come, I think, tomorrow. There's a large protest planned, and this, I think, will be, we'll see if this ends up being a kind of street battle, who will show up to the protests, and what will the army do. The one thing that I found puzzling in all of this was the reaction of the Egyptian opposition to the arrival of the army onto the streets. The protesters really greeted the army as a kind of national institution that was restoring order, but in fact, Egypt has always been a military regime. So even though Mubarak had in recent years been, teetering between naming his son but the underpinnings of this regime had always been military. And so part of the blame for the misfortunes of the Egyptian people always lay with this military regime. The military controls something like 40% of the Egyptian economy. And so what worries me is exactly as you said, a yearning for order, therefore an acquiescence to the arrival of the military and the military taking control, which will then have resulted in a change in nothing.
Yes, please.
My name is Arik Ibrahim. I'm a mid-career candidate and I'm Egyptian. The question is about a third scenario, and my question is to the panel, a third future scenario, whether the panel would see as a possible scenario or not. Is it possible that the international community, along with the US, are able to exert enough pressure so that the next vice president would be a person who is slightly likable to the Egyptian and acceptable to US, such as, for example, Amr Moussa, and then they would, and then President Mubarak would be asked to step down, because something like this, I think, would be acceptable to the Egyptian people who do not want to see him or anybody on representing the old regime in his place. Thank you.
So an interesting suggestion. Amr Moussa, former Egyptian foreign minister, Secretary General of the Arab League, could he be a transitional figure? Could El Baradei to help pave the way for, I think, this very good suggestion, how they might move forward?
You mentioned, again, the Poland example. I think we shouldn't rule out the possibility that somebody like, say, Omar Sleiman could turn out to be a Jaruzelski, General Jaruzelski, who was named by the Soviets to take care of Solidarity, turned out to be somebody who worked with Solidarity for a peaceful transition to democracy. So there has to be, among the 80 million wonderful Egyptians, there has to be 50,000 qualified people who can play key leadership roles in a society that has approximately 5,500 years of running its own affairs. I mean, this is the most organized, experienced society at managing urban development and human dignity anywhere in the world. There's nobody who has more experience than the Egyptians. So I don't think there's any problem, and that scenario is a perfectly realistic one. Will the Egyptian people be allowed to do it? I think this is the big question. This is a critical moment of transition now to see how these various opposition forces will work together to bring about the transition. Transitions are tough for military rule. I'm worried about too much emphasis on the military as the great savior. Militaries are good at defending borders. They're not good at running internal affairs, and I think we should take the focus away from the military.
Thank you. Yes?
My name is Brian Haggerty. I'm a PhD student in international relations at MIT. A number of you have pointed to the role of the military as the great unknown going forward, and I hate to put emphasis back on the military, but I wonder if you could comment specifically on civil-military relations in Egypt versus Tunisia and then versus these other countries that we're looking at now and what may happen in these countries. What do we actually know about the relationship between Mubarak and the military in Egypt, especially versus the relationship between Ben Ali and the Tunisian military also?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Segal.
Yes, great question. The Tunisian regime under Ben Ali was not a military regime. It was a police state, even if Ben Ali had origins within the military. So the pillar of the regime was the Ministry of Interior and the political police. And therefore, the police was, in a way, the spoiled child of the regime, and the army was, in a way, marginalized a little bit in terms of resources. It has only 12 helicopters. I don't know if you realize what it means. So it was, even during the revolution, it was very much stretched, and it took a neutral position in the sense that, more than a neutral position, that General Ammar, who was the head of the army, refused to fire on the demonstrators. He was fired by Ben Ali and then came back after Ben Ali left, right? So the army in Tunisia, it doesn't have the same standing as in Egypt. It's not, you know, the army of Abdel Nasser, and it doesn't have the same, I would say, national standing. It's not the spine of the regime, but it played an important role by refusing to fire on the demonstrators, and later took a more neutral position, protecting the protesters in the street until the end, until the second interim government in January, I think January 17, if I remember well. So it played a very important role, not in the transition that we're going to see now, but before that, in the sense that it has led the revolution toward order rather than chaos.
Tarek. Yes, Professor, please.
Yes. I mean, we talk about the army. I think there's the perception of the army by the Egyptians, which is on the whole a good perception. There's the army's own perception of itself, which I think it's in a great state of fear at the moment, and there's a great deal of division. Not feeling that it doesn't want to be drawn into politics, that it will be drawn into politics if it starts killing a large number of people. Not knowing what is best for it, how to protect its interest in the peace treaty and in military industry and so on. So I see divided councils at the top. It's not as though Field Marshal Tantawi can just give an order and everybody will obey it. There seems to be some doubt now whether if he did give an order to do certain kinds of things, whether it would be obeyed. So I think that the army is feeling itself along very slowly and also, as I say, not willing to go too far in order to annoy the United States, on which it is totally dependent. So whether it is a coherent force capable of doing something, I think probably much better to think about it is there's a kind of an alliance between Tantawi at the head of the army and Omar Suleiman, and somehow or other they have to work out how they're going to get from now to September and the presidential election, and the hope that Mubarak will actually go and a new lot of presidential candidates will appear.
Professor Owen and Tarek, so the U.S. government has given approximately $30 billion, $35 billion, I guess, to the Egyptian military since the Camp David Accords of '79. Is that the avenue of U.S. influence, more from the Pentagon to the military versus what President Obama is trying to do with the civilian leadership?
Well, I think it is, yes, but I don't know what Tarek thinks.
Tarek, what do you think?
I agree with Professor Owen in this, as in all things, that Yeah, absolutely. It's not simply the money, it's the training. You know, I was once talking with, this is not about the military, but it gives you a sense of how everybody perceives the United States and Egypt. I was talking with a couple of Muslim Brotherhood members, one a senior member and some young guys. And we're talking about the United States, and the young guy says to this, we're listening to the senior member, and I says to him, I heard that America is about to fail. America's about to collapse. Is that true? And he said, my son, I don't want America to collapse. America feeds me right now. I can't have America collapse. And I think that, you know, so the dependence on the United States, of, you know, of the military, Egyptians in general believe somehow that we are very dependent on the U.S. I think we have a lot of leverage. And so when people say that the United States doesn't have any leverage, I think they're just shirking responsibility, and particularly with the military.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
My name's Sarah Altantawi. I'm a PhD student in religion. My question, unfortunately, is also about the military in Egypt. My question is this idea that the army is this beloved force, I think, may have started to crack last night when many of us were watching snipers fire on protesters and the army stood back and watched. And from what I can tell, this has had quite an effect on this unblemished image of the army. So my question is there an end game to what's going on in Egypt that does not involve a military government? And if there is a possibility for a coalition government of protesters, El Baradei, Muslim Brotherhood, etc., how do we get there?
Thank you.
What's the process by which you get there?
Great question. Could I just add to it, with your permission? I was watching the same live video. It was murky. Is there a distinction between the army and the security forces?
Oh, absolutely.
And are they acting in a very different fashion?
Yeah, absolutely distinction between the army and the security forces. The question that you ask, is there a scenario here that does not put the military in control at any point, right? And that is the problem, because I think even those among the opposition some are willing to have a kind of interim government in which the military plays some caretaker role. And while Rami may believe that Omar Suleiman is Jaruzelski, I look at the Egyptian experience with military government, it's not a good one. In Egypt, they don't like to go back to the barracks. That's just our historical experience. Let's go with it. So there is a way in which you could actually get from where we are today to a process, to an end point in which the military is out of politics. Okay? But I cannot see it happening without significant U.S. pressure. So there is a roadmap. I've actually written it up, and I won't bore you all with it because it will take more than my allotted time. But you could do it. The problem is that you've got to get the military on board with this idea that it's not going to be able to control this. And this is something that they're reluctant to do, because there's a culture in the military. Egypt is the pivotal nation. Egypt is under severe threat from all sides and all angles. And how can we, and Omar Suleiman said something like this today in his interview on the Egyptian television. How, you know, we have to shoulder this, you know, we need strong leadership so that Egypt can shoulder its critical responsibilities. And they're not going to leave this to the irresponsible riffraff, the democratic process that can bring me the Muslim Brothers or the Nasserists, or people who are going to be responsive to popular passions instead of Egypt's hard national interest. So getting them to let go is going to be very difficult.
Right.
Just a point. We have a very interesting experience in the Arab world with Sudan. You know, people are saying Tunis was the first revolt. It wasn't. Sudan in 1985 was the first revolt that, where popular pressure overthrew Numeiri. And then you had Suad al-Dahab, a general who took over for a year and made a transition. We had something similar in Mauritania a few years ago. So we have indigenous examples in the Arab world of military leaders who assume power for a transitional moment. And as happened to, say, Gorbachev, FW de Klerk in South Africa, the people in Northern Ireland, they realize at some moment that the system that they're heading is not sustainable. And they realize it for reasons that, you know, psychologists only can tell us, that they have to make changes. And when the army is seen as the guarantor of security and provides that space for civilians to then take over, this is a formula that has worked before in the Arab world. And can probably work again. It's a long shot. Getting that transitional mechanism is not easy. Hopefully the Egyptians will do it by a coalition of all of these forces with clear support from abroad for this kind of transition, then going to quick elections and building in mechanisms for the single most important thing that has to be instituted across the entire Arab world, which is civilian oversight of security, intelligence, and military services. That is the single most important thing that has to be somehow instituted. The Turks just did it. The Soviet Empire, all of them have virtually done it. It can be done. And what Tunis has said, has proven so far, is the Arabs will no longer be the exception to the global tide towards democratization and accountability of governance. So I think the military can play this role, and it's a long shot, but it has been done before and it can be done again.
And so the leading question, I'm sure someone's going to ask it, is, if you're right, Rami, if military rule since '52 is going to end, what is the civilian alternative? Is it the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it a coalition of democratic politicians? It is a combination of the two, but I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute. Yes?
Excuse me. My name is Hani Muafi, faculty at Boston University. My question is to the panel is about a medium-term perspective on participation. I think the focus on personalities or the military focuses on top-down centralized power, whereas we see that what's happened recently in Tunis and Egypt is really more about decentralized kind of aggregation of power. And the Egyptian government and maybe the Tunisian government, having pulled back their security forces, hoping that chaos would reign in the streets and people would yearn for that, authoritarian hand from the top again. And we see that people kind of self-organized into these committees. And I think actually it's one of the most beneficial outgrowths of what happened, is people found that everybody can have a role. Looking maybe not in this transitional term, but in the medium term, how can we move towards different societal structures in the Middle East, maybe even parliamentary structures that de-emphasize consolidated executive control and kind of distribute legitimacy across different sectors in society?
Thank you. Professor Owen, Mr. Segal?
Go ahead.
Good. No, I find myself speechless for some reason.
All right. Very good question.
Yes.
Whoever would like to answer.
Why don't, Rami, you start, or I can go, but I'm following the Arab deference to seniority. So I mean, your point is that.
Very good.
So if I let me.
The Arab deference is to Egypt.
You go first, Charles.
So am I right? What your question is? What exactly? That you're trying to find out if there's some process towards democracy that's.
I see these as so radically different. It's not just the young and old. The editorial cartoon I keep expecting is Mubarak calling up Ben Ali saying, "What the heck's a Twitter?" Because
so you're saying there's a kind of generational gap here.
Well, no, not a generational gap. What I'm saying is that in many ways, I think having more representative institutions that are more broadly representative, that involve more...
That's what the people want. I mean, the people want, yeah, right, absolutely. And look, here's the thing, and something that might explain the variation that we're seeing among Arab states in terms of their, in terms of the protest, right? It may actually be the sort of, the level of sort of civil society that you have, predating the protest, right? So in Syria, for example, I don't know, but I would be surprised if there was, if what happened in Egypt would be repeated in Syria. And in part, I think that's because in Egypt there is a little bit more civil society. There is a little bit more kind of social organizing than is allowed in Syria. And I would also, like in the Gulf states, for example, part of it is that, yes, these are rich, content states, and so nobody is that upset with the regime. But another part of it is that because everybody's fed by the regime, there isn't the kind of robust civil society that you have in a place where people kind of need to rely on each other. So I think that might be an important determinant of when you see this protest.
I'd like to try to respond to your question. It's a very difficult question. I think in Tunisia and probably in Egypt too, there was a complete disconnect, right, between the people, the youth in particular, and the state. There was a sense of humiliation, but there was also a disconnect in terms of these regime not understanding what was happening. When Ben Ali, before he fled, he didn't really understand what was going on, right? Now, there were bloggers blogging underground. One of them was Slim Amamu. He was blogging. His name is Slim 404. And 404 is the message you get when you get an error message on your computer, right? Because of the censorship, you know, you always got those messages. But he was blogging trying to circumvent the censorship of the internet. Now, when the interim government, the second interim government was created, he got a position in the government. He's Secretary of State for the Youth, Secrétaire d'État à la Jeunesse, right? And during the ministers, all the ministers meeting, he tweets. And so you and I can read everything he's thinking about the meeting and everything that's taking place. He's probably censoring a few things, but it's quite fun to look at that. So, but it's very unrealistic for me to see that, because on the other hand, there are also, you know, old generations within this ministry. So how the presence of Slim Amamu is an anecdote, but it's very interesting. You know, will it hold somewhere? Will it have an effect? I'm not sure. And I think I can't really respond to your question except by giving you this anecdote. We'll have to wait and see really, you know, how things will develop in the coming months and years.
Thank you very much. We would normally end about now, but we've decided to extend this for 15 more minutes until 7:30. And thank you for your patience. We have so many people who want to talk. We'll try to get in as many questions and as many brief answers as we can. Yes, sir.
My name is Richard Salomon. I feel there's a prism that we have not examined in this discussion tonight that I think is very significant, and that is the precepts of religion. The Salaf es-Salahi, the elders of the tenets of fundamental Islam, not the Shiites, but the Salafis. And that's an area I'd like to hear discussed. I'm also interested in a more essential opinion of the Gama Islamiyah and their tension vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda and their dislike of one another in the equation. No leader like Turkey, like Kemal Ataturk, has arisen to lead the country. And this is rather interesting. There's a vacuum there that tomorrow in the mosques there will be sermons. And there may be someone suggesting the theme of those sermons, but I have not had privilege to sit in there, and I'd like to know what you suspect is going on there. So these are areas that I think are highly important, because we have been dealing with autocracies, and in Lebanon you have a nice split between the Maronites and the Maronites and Islam and the way they hold seats of power. I'd like to hear what you think about these essential potential religious elements like Khomeini, who arose in Iran back in 1979.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll just make a couple of quick comments. It's interesting you mentioned Ataturk. Ataturk's experience led to a rather militaristic army state for decades and decades and decades, which was finally democratized by mild Islamists when Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party came in. So I think we need to look at the Islamists and politics in the Arab countries in the Middle East with, I think, more nuance and to understand that they represent a force that has grown powerful because there was no other force that could grow in the half a century in which the Arab police state and Arab modern security state, heavily supported by Western powers, did not allow any other expression of public opinion, pluralism, or sentiment. When the system loosened up a little bit and Islamists were allowed to play the game, some of them won, like in Turkey, and they became much more pragmatic and much more secular. And the balance that you have is a balance which is similar to the, say, Christian Democrats in Europe, where you have a democratic process that is defined by the three constituent elements of the Arab world, which is Arabism, tribalism, and Islam. And those three find a balance among themselves. So I think the Islamist boogeyman is a huge diversion and really should not be seriously discussed at all. These societies will find their own balance. The Islamists have gone strong because autocrats supported by the West did not allow any other options. When the other options are there, the Islamists then take their normal form, which is 15 to 20%, and that should be something that people shouldn't worry about too much.
Yeah, I agree very much with this. And I'd like to add that when Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the historical leader of the Islamist movement and Nahda in Tunisia, came back, he declared that he would never touch the, or never put into question the personal status code, which recognizes equality between men and women, prohibits polygamy and repudiation. And he has also declared that his motto was the AKP, the Turkish AKP. And he also said he compared himself and his movement to the Christian Democrats. So in a way, what we see also with the integration of the Islamist movement is really their moderation, their routinization into political parties that do not claim to be Islamist parties, but very often Islamist parties with a religious or an Islamist reference. And this is the case also in Morocco with the Party of Justice and Development that has been there for a few years now and participates in parliamentary politics. So just to go in the same direction of moderation, and there are a force to count with, but we shouldn't use them as an excuse to go against history, against democratization.
I think Islamists, too, seem to be pretty smart about this now, that they know that their presence can be used as an excuse to shortcut the democratic process. So you see in Egypt, for example, they're very conscientiously self-effacing. They're not really at the forefront of these things. And so one could worry, and I understand, I get this question a lot, that they're hanging in the background, that basically what we're looking at right now is Russia in 1917, but in February, right? We're not yet in October.
Kerensky versus
Lenin.
Kerensky,
right. So Al-Baradei makes a wonderful Kerensky. Alex Kaysar, our historian colleague, was pushing me on this. And that the Muslim Brothers will eventually capture any revolution, just like what happened in Iran in 1979. But if you compare the Muslim Brothers to the Islamists in Iran, the Muslim Brothers are a kind of quasi-political party that a lot of people like and a lot of people don't like. Okay, I've studied them for about 8 years. I don't feel comfortable telling you they're 15% or 20%, but they're not 100%. Okay, I'm not even sure they're 50%. In Iran, on the other hand, this was the clergy, okay, and that the clergy has an enormous amount of power and legitimacy. You can't argue with them. There's a kind of concept among the Shia clergy, something called a particular clergy, not the Walayat al-Faqih. I'm talking about Marja' al-Taqlid. That a cleric can be a source of emulation. That doesn't, so you see, what does this guy do? Does he brush his teeth in the morning this way? I'll do the same thing. We don't have anything like that in the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't occupy any equivalent stature. So I'm not as worried, but I understand those who are worried. But I think that, they've behaved pretty responsibly so far.
Thank you very much. Interesting question. Got a good response from the panel. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dominic Longo. I'm a doctoral student in Arabic and Islamic studies, deep personal ties to Egypt. My question is about very short-term strategy in Egypt, especially given the negotiation showdown with the protesters, the opposition, epitomized by those in Tahrir, saying no dialogue until Mubarak steps down, on the one hand, and then the regime, in the voice of Suleiman, saying no dialogue until Tahrir is cleared. If you were given the chance to give wise counsel to either side in the next days or week, what would some of the main points of your counsel be?
Pastor Owen, do you want to?
Well, I think that's fairly clear, I think. I mean, you have to show how you get from here to September to the people there, showing that the revolution is in good hands, but that it's going to be guided towards elections, which will be open to all political parties, and a presidential election, which will be open to all candidates. And you also have to produce some carrots at some stage, and that's one of the problems. I mean, clearly it would benefit whoever is in power if they had some money to distribute. So I can see what ought to happen. Whether that's going to happen is another matter.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natalie Southwick. I don't think I'm old enough to even pretend that I go here. But my question, the thing I've noticed in particular with Egypt is that there's been such a crackdown on information coming out of it. Not so much with Tunisia because, like you said, Professor, no one was paying attention. But from shutting off the internet to arresting Egyptian bloggers to the attacks on Al Jazeera and CNN crews this week, there's been a really overt effort to prevent information from getting out of Egypt through many of the traditional channels. And I'm curious what that says about Mubarak and the fact that perhaps he doesn't care about how he's perceived now, and also the kind of information that the rest of the Arab world and the international community is receiving about what's going on in Egypt and really how much we can trust.
And just late this afternoon, there were reports of further arrests of international journalists. Secretary Hillary Clinton made a very strong statement condemning the Egyptian government for this. So the stakes are, it's a very good question.
It was clear after, oh, sorry, do you want to, go ahead, تفضل.
As the journalist with four distinguished academics, I should say that we've seen this over and over. I remember going to Iraq in 1975 and to visit my parents. My father was stationed in Baghdad with the United Nations, and the people at the airport took away my portable typewriter because I was a journalist. They probably knew that, but I wasn't going to work. I was going to visit my parents, but I had my typewriter. And this is as old as time. People take away the means of communication when they feel threatened. I don't think we should worry too much about it in the short run because the technology that we have and the determination of the people will always get around these things. I think just on the point of Twitter and blogging and all that, I think there's been a vast exaggeration of the importance of the social media. It accelerates and expands a process that starts with the basic courage of individuals who will stand up and confront the political system that they feel oppresses them. The media helps this process, but it starts with the courage of individuals.
I think two things. I think you're absolutely right that the Mubarak government's decision to shut off the internet really revealed something essential about this regime that perhaps some of us didn't see. When Ben Ali fell, I was in Egypt, and all of my friends were saying, well, of course that guy, look, can you believe how he restricted Facebook? I mean, this is unbelievable. Not knowing what was in store for them when Mubarak finally concluded it was kill or be killed. Regarding Twitter and Facebook and all these things, I think, Rami is absolutely right. I mean, my feeling is that these kinds of social media, their relationship to protest, they're like shoes, right? You don't want to go to a protest without shoes. You need to have some shoes. They'll help you. But you wouldn't say that the shoes caused the protest. And I think it's the same way with this social media.
Thank you. It's been a great discussion. We have time for only one more question. You have the final word.
Thank you. My name is Lotfi Sebi. I'm from Tunisia. I am also from the city of Sidi Bouzid. So I happen to be right in the middle of the... Well, I don't know, unlike Tarek, I don't know if it's a fortune or a misfortune. I learned how to throw the, the hand grenades back. Not hand grenades, the gas things. But I'm a little nervous still thinking, whenever I see crowds like this in the streets. I just wanted to quickly make a couple of points and maybe ask a question.
And we just have I'm sorry, it's a little bit of time left. So
okay, certainly. One regarding leadership for the youth of Arab countries. I think the United States, as a government, we're missing a great opportunity because I spent quite a bit of time in North Africa and in the Middle East, not paying too much attention to what goes on in the street. We read newspapers, we rely on old-fashioned way of sort of analyzing data, but we don't really have people in there that are intermingling with the young people, as I do. I have a company, and I employ people in Tunisia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Egypt, in Morocco. So I always get questions like, why do they hate us, but we love everything American? When Obama speaks of democracy, does he only just mean democracy for the US? I try to explain that perhaps democracy and stability are not mutually exclusive, or maybe they are in certain parts of the world. So not paying attention, and I think Rami, Mr. Khouri, brought up a great point in that maybe 10, 15 years from today, we will be looking at Tunisia, who Professor Zagal said is not that important. But I think geopolitically should be extremely important, because maybe 10, 15 years from now, we'll be looking at another Iran.
And a question.
The question is, what, if I'm looking here at the future generation, future leadership of the United States, what advice would you give them in terms of how to deal with the street, the young people? 50% of Tunisians are less than the age of 25 years of age.
Thank you, Professor Zagal.
No, I didn't say Tunisia was not so important. It's very important to me, and
I meant
it's a very important. What has happened is very important, but I was talking about the geopolitical level, I really think it's for the Tunisians to think about the question of the youth and how does the youth get new opportunities at the economic level, but also the political level, right? There is a sense of despair. There is a sense that everything is blocked in front of them. And so how do the Tunisians open those opportunities for the youth? And that's the question for all Tunisians to debate today. I really truly hope that we'll have the opportunity to think about this as Tunisians, but also that this will be the case in Egypt too. So I sympathize with your desire to fix that problem, but I think the path will be very long.
That has to be the final word, Professor Zagal. It's been a fascinating discussion at a very important time. Thank you for your collective wisdom. Thank you.